Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. My name is Namdi Iregbulem, and I'm a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners. And today I'm joined by an individual I got to know in the last year who was a very impressive researcher in the AI space. His name is Daniel Kang. Daniel is a assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and his research centers around a bunch of topics that are certainly of deep interest to me, and I think a lot of folks who will be watching this, sort of the intersection of AI, security, safety, agents, etc. That's just a sampling. His research spans, many other domains as well. Daniel got his PhD. He did a master's at the University of Cambridge, and before that, his undergrad at MIT. And super excited to be talking to Daniel today about two of his papers, one of which is unpublished as of this recording, but will be published by the time of this publication. And then the second paper we'll get to in a bit. But before that, Daniel, did I miss anything? Should I have embellished more? What else should we say about you?
No, not much else to say. I guess on the side, I also enjoy working with technologists of all forms. So I've also consulted with organizations ranging from the US government to OpenAI to startups, and I advise a few startups on the side as well. So I like to do a bunch of different things, and I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so one of those startups is my own, which I should probably mention. And maybe I characterize your research agenda a bit, but maybe in your own words, it'd be helpful for you to share a little bit more about the topic areas you're most excited about, and then we can dive into the papers.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, my research focuses on ways that I think we can make sure that the deployment of AI widely goes well. And as an academic, that means I've largely focused on AI agents, in particular related to AI agents and security of all forms. So this is both AI agents applied to cybersecurity and the security implications of AI agents. Beyond that, I also have some work around deploying AI agents, sorry, allowing non-experts to deploy AI agents, but we're not going to be talking about that today. So primarily focus on the AI agents and security.
Perfect. And so the first paper that we'll discuss, and I'll just throw up on the screen very quickly, is a paper called CVE-Bench, a benchmark for AI agents' ability to exploit real-world web application vulnerabilities. And for folks who maybe aren't familiar with some of the lingo, CVE, correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel's common vulnerabilities and exposures or exploits. What is it?
It's just a catch-all phrase for real-world vulnerabilities that
Yeah.
are in the specific database format.
Yeah. And so I thought this was a really, really interesting, piece of work. And, where I always like to start is kind of, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but in the way that we prompt LLMs, humans are prompted too by various things. And so I'm wondering what prompted the creation of CVE Bench? What gaps were you trying to address? What sort of ignited the spark around, this idea?
I find that very funny, thinking about how humans can be prompted. But to answer your question directly, there are two things that prompted this specific work. The first is I've been thinking about AI benchmarks for some period of time. And the second is actually going to be the second paper we'll be talking about using AI agents to exploit cybersecurity vulnerabilities. But on the former, we will have upcoming work on this as well, actually. But AI agent benchmarks are really difficult to do well, but also perhaps some of the most interesting ways to actually measure AI. So historically, Sweetbench is a great example of an initial benchmark, which was released and got a lot of attention. And subsequently, there are lots of issues found with Sweetbench. So OpenAI worked with the folks who constructed Sweetbench to construct Sweetbench Verified. And the reason that agentic benchmarks are so difficult to construct is that the tasks can be very varied, and automatically grading them can be very challenging. And we looked at the cybersecurity space, and what we found is that there are a bunch of benchmarks in cybersecurity, both for humans and for AI, but they all suffer from two major issues. The first issue is that they're not end to end. So a lot of benchmarks focus on one specific task, and which is obviously important, and we should definitely be measuring that, but it doesn't measure long range capabilities. And the second is that the benchmarks that do ostensibly measure these don't have a way of actually measuring if the AI agent did the actual task at hand. And we thought that this was a big gap, so we put in a lot of effort into building this benchmark.
Could you double click on that? What does it mean to not be able to measure the task or whether the task was completed?
Right. So let me give you a concrete example. Let's say we have a web application with a specific vulnerability. I'm just going to make something up. Let's say a SQL injection.
Hmm.
One thing that you can do is that you can say, okay, well, I know this application has a SQL injection. So I'm just going to ask an AI, does this website have a vulnerability? And the AI might say, yes, it does have a vulnerability. It has a SQL injection vulnerability. The problem with this approach of grading is that AIs are very psychopathic. In other words, they'll basically say yes to whatever your request is at a very high rate.
Hmm.
So if you ask this run this exact same procedure, but ask it for a vulnerability that doesn't exist, the AI will actually say yes a large fraction of the time. And so it's not actually a reliable way to tell if the AI actually knows if there's a vulnerability in the system under test or not.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. It's sort of an unreliable narrator in a certain sense. And then something else you mentioned was, long range. I forget what term you used for trajectories. Or when you say that, you mean essentially multi-step or multiple actions in a sequence of some sort.
Yeah, that's right. So our benchmark focuses on end-to-end detection and exploitation. So the agent must explore the environment, which in this case are web applications. So it actually
Hmm.
has to click around and figure out what the vulnerability is, and then actually exploit it. So at the very least, it requires finding the endpoint that's vulnerable and then carrying out the exploitation. This is, of course, if you know the solution. So it's a minimum of two steps. In what we found in practice is that the number of steps can be quite large. It can range
Hmm.
to 20 plus steps to find and exploit the vulnerabilities.
I'm curious, like, if it takes like 20, for example, does it tend to be more spent on the kind of finding the place to attack and then less on the figuring out how to attack it, or the reverse? Or
That's a great question. It's quite difficult to disentangle this because a lot of what the agent does is that it has a hypothesis. Oh, I think this endpoint might be vulnerable to this kind of vulnerability,
yeah.
and it tries it. And based off of that feedback from the environment, it will then try something else if it, say, doesn't succeed. So it's actually a little bit difficult to measure this, and I don't have the statistics offhand,
Yeah.
but it does a mix of both for sure.
Okay. One of the things I want to ask you is sort of why web applications as like the chosen, almost sort of like attack surface. Like why was that a good choice for this kind of benchmark?
Yeah, great question. So there's two answers to this. The first answer is just that there's actually a really great benchmark from Percy Liang's group at Stanford called CVE-Bench
Hmm.
that covers a wide range of cybersecurity tasks and a bit more of the single step. Okay, so it's not literally single step, but a little more self-contained way. And because it covers a wide range of cybersecurity tasks, we felt like we should focus on one class of applications that we thought were important. And this brings me to the second point where we focus on web applications, which is that web applications are often the portal into many severe cybersecurity attacks. So, for example, I'm going to just name two names, but tons and tons of places have had similar incidents or potential exposures. Both Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure have been vulnerable to what are called server-side request forgeries, SSRFs, that could hypothetically allow an attacker to gain unauthorized access to literally Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure, which is
Hmm.
in a web format. And also, you can sort of imagine how severe this would be if
That'd be bad.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we're not testing if Google Cloud is vulnerable, but the severity of vulnerabilities of web applications can be much higher than what people might expect. Just to give you another example, back in 2016 or 2017, there was a cryptocurrency exchange that was hacked, like it was a web app that was hacked to the tune of $50 million because of a concurrency bug in their database.
What year was that?
2016 or 17.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. Web applications are important. They make the world go around for better or worse in this kind of modern era, and so they're a very plausible and appropriate choice here. When you think about, and maybe you've touched on this a little bit already, but when you think about some of the technical hurdles you faced in either kind of building the sandboxing or the benchmark itself, like what do you think was most challenging about the construction of the benchmark and the kind of environment in which the agents were acting, et cetera?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked because this is the kind of thing which you can sort of say on a podcast, but it's actually really difficult to say in an academic paper because some of it is qualitative.
Uh,
Building this benchmark was actually an enormous effort. So the author list you saw had 15 or 16 authors. I can't even I lose track myself. And one of the reasons why agentic benchmarks are so difficult to construct as a whole is that simply reproducing the environment can be challenging. So there were some CVEs, so basically web applications with vulnerabilities that we reproduced that took 24 hours to reproduce, like 24 hours of work, not
yeah,
like
human labor.
human labor time. Yeah. And this is because we wanted to make sure that the vulnerability was actually present. So we reproduced the environment that the web application ran in, actually did the exploit ourselves manually to confirm it was actually there. I'm not aware of essentially any other benchmark, agentic benchmark, that manually confirmed every single task in the benchmark. But there's a lot of benchmarks,
Yeah.
so maybe I'm missing some. So this was like a monumental effort. The other extremely challenging thing for web applications at large is automatically grading. So one of the things we could have done is we could have just released the target containers with the vulnerabilities and said, look at the traces, like manually inspect the traces, or use an AI to inspect the traces.
Hmm.
The problem with this is the kind of the false positive issue that I mentioned earlier, where an
Right.
AI will happily say that an exploit was found even though it wasn't. And so we actually had to build a grader per application and per vulnerability to ensure that we could test if the vulnerability was exploited in a foolproof way. And this is also an enormous amount of effort. We're gonna package up some of our findings and release a report on agentic benchmarks in a couple of months, and hopefully we'll have a lot more to say when that comes out.
Do you, I mean, even just on that point, like, do you feel like that has any implications for the general ability of LLMs to be used to kind of evaluate the behavior of other LLMs? Even just expanding outside the context of this particular work?
Definitely. This has actually been widely reported in the academic literature. That being said, for many practical applications, LLM as a judge is actually pretty good.
Yeah.
It's highly context dependent, and it also depends on how much the false negatives or false positives affect your application. So LLMs are kind of used in almost every aspect of the economy now. It's really difficult for me to give general thoughts on when and when not to use it.
Hmm.
But I will say, for any application where you need high assurance, I strongly recommend, at the very least, seeing how good LM as a judge is before deploying it widely. And we think that for something like this, where there are safety implications around, say, pre-deployment testing of models, we thought it was very important to ensure that our grading was as bulletproof as possible.
Yep, very good points. And so, another thing I wanted to ask you about was it feels like when people talk about agents these days, it's not perfectly synonymous with tool use, but it sort of almost always involves some amount of tool use. Very often it does. And so I'm curious, kind of like where you place tool use in the context of these kind of based cybersecurity attacks. And I know in the paper you at least at some points you equip the agents with SQL map, which my understanding is that that's something you would use to conduct SQL injection attacks. But maybe talk a bit about tool use in this particular context and how you thought about it as you were trying to equip these models to take on these tasks.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, tool use is incredibly important for high performing AI systems writ large, especially for complex systems. So for our specific use case, at the very least, the agent needs to be able to access a web browser. This is kind of a non-starter for web applications.
Yeah.
We also gave it tools like SQL Map, a Python interpreter, and a Bash environment, which were also all very helpful. Proficient tool use is incredibly important for high performance. And so one of the things that we found is that the Sci agent that the Sci bench paper used is not as proficient on web applications because, and one of the reasons for that is that there was less of a focus on tool use for that specific agent. Even beyond our work, there's a lot of academic work and a lot of work in industry showing that tools can be super important. We saw, like, say, deep research from OpenAI, which uses web browsing as a tool, coding agents, being able to actually execute code and see the results. It's also incredibly important there as well. So tool use is just very important for high performance.
Yeah, and maybe comment a little bit on like where we are in the journey of tool use, by which I mean, in some sense, it feels like we're still in the earliest days where in some cases, even getting the models to reliably use the tools is its own effort. But obviously, this is only the beginning, and there's a long way to go from here. Kind of characterize where we're at, or even kind of what you're excited about as you think about tool use going forward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Tool use today is still in its infancy. The great thing about AI, though, and also now that there are lots of base model providers, is that, back in, say, 2000, if you had a problem with hardware and you just waited 18 months, you would no longer have a problem with hardware. The chips would just get faster. I feel very blessed to be in a situation where it feels very similar for AI capabilities, including tool use. Tool use was like pretty, pretty bad 18 months ago.
Yeah.
And now it's like actually pretty decent in a lot of circumstances, but of course, still in its infancy. I just anticipate that the base model providers will put a lot of effort into this and really improve the capabilities around tool use. And sorry, do you ask another question as well? I've
No, that was basically the question, and I can say personally, I've just been playing around a lot with this stuff lately, and I've loaded up every whether it's Claude desktop or the different IDEs I use with these like MCP servers, which have been really fun to play around with, and again, still models are still getting better at actually using them, but it's fun to almost like you can kind of like prototype agents, very simple agents, just using basic tool use, and then you can think about how to robustify it from there. But so that's been fun to play around with. Maybe let's talk about the actual benchmark results, and in particular, I want to bring up this is figure 3, where you talk about some of the success rates of the different LLM agents on the benchmark. Maybe like contextualize this a bit. So, agents can exploit up to 13 and 25% of vulnerabilities in 0-day and 1-day contexts. Like, is that a high number? Is that a low number? Like, how should we like think about those results?
Right. So going back to AI capabilities, these numbers should be thought of as a point in time measurement. 12 months from now, I anticipate that these numbers are going to go up. 24 months from now, probably even higher. So computer security is a really tricky field to discuss because in a lot of other circumstances, if you have a 13% success rate, that's a completely unusable tool. You literally just throw it out, don't even consider it.
Yeah.
The problem with computer security, especially for attackers, is that if an attacker succeeds once,
Mm-hmm.
especially if it's a high criticality vulnerability, for example, if they can just do arbitrary and remote code execution on the target server, that can have really severe consequences, even if it succeeds only one time. So even though 13 and 25% seem low, and they are relative to, say, other AI benchmarks, it still signifies, I think, that these AI agents are proficient in cybersecurity tasks. And my personal opinion is that anyone who is relying on security through obscurity, basically hoping that attackers don't find your vulnerabilities in your system, that's going to go out the window once this is deployed in the wild, because the attacker only needs to succeed one time to get access to your systems.
Yeah, it's a little bit of like the inverse of the actual the typical critique of agents, which is that they're not reliable, and or even just autoregressive models in general, or sort of they have some level of reliability. You compound that, those percentages multiply, and eventually you're going to get it's going to have some sort of failure. Here it's kind of flipping that on its head, and it's saying, well, actually that's to the benefit of the attackers, the fact that whatever the odds are, it can be repeated over and over until you find the opening. And so it's a pretty in that sense disadvantageous situation for defenders, I guess. Is there, you mentioned kind of the sort of obscurity defense being not particularly robust in this context. Is there an alternative that you suggest, or where do you go from here or from there?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the nice things about a system like this is that you can use it both on the offense and on the defense. And in particular, a defender has, well, fingers crossed, more information about their own system than the attacker does. For example, like the code, the deployment settings,
Yeah,
and they
let's
can
let's
also,
let's hope. If you
yeah,
don't, then you're really in a really tough spot. But yeah.
fingers crossed. But this means that, especially if you have like a digital twin that you can use for pre-deployment testing, you can actually deploy these kinds of technologies in-house ahead of time. There are already some companies that are working on deploying this technology widely. And, anyone who is interested in using this kind of technology, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'd love to find ways to help you guys deploy, help anyone deploy this technology in pre-deployment testing, especially if it's like a critical infrastructure or anything else.
And before we move on to your next paper, aside from folks reaching out directly to you, which they definitely should, do you have any sort of like practical advice or guidance for folks in industry who are just trying to think through these challenges?
Yeah, one of the annoying things about computer security is that it would be great if AI could help with everything, but a lot of it boils down to, it's called standard best practices, which is, if an open source software system or package you're using has a vulnerability, you should probably update it. You should probably use two-factor authentication everywhere, things like this. That actually, these really simple things actually get a lot of the way there. Same with things like automatic vulnerability scanners get you a lot of the way there. Yeah, I would definitely say that, security is a hard thing because people rarely think about it until it bites them. But yeah,
Right.
think about these things proactively and think about the world where AI agents are going to be trying to exploit your systems in all different ways.
Yeah, I feel like in some sense we're lucky in some sense that there haven't been too many major AI related security incidents, breaches, etc. Yet, and so it can feel like maybe it's not the most critical thing to be covering right now, but it's coming quickly to your point, and this is just going to be the new era that we're in, and people are going to have to adapt. That's just the way it's going to be. Speaking of creative ways to find vulnerabilities in systems, we should maybe switch to your second paper, and is called "Teams of Agents Can Exploit Zero-Day Vulnerabilities." I always love the descriptive titles. Yeah, I thought this paper was really really interesting as well. I think you took a very innovative approach. Maybe just to start, let's actually start with that approach. So you sort of have this almost kind of hierarchical structure with which you kind of construct this team of agents, and where you have sort of like specialized agents and folks orchestrating and whatnot. Maybe talk about why this kind of approach versus more of just kind of like a single agent approach, and what sorts of insights led you to that.
Yeah, the primary reason that we had a more complex approach for this paper is exactly the reason that you talked about in terms of errors compounding. So what we found is that I want to be a little bit careful here. There have been lots of claims from model providers about long context performance.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found is that when the context window gets to a certain point, performance degrades quite a bit. And this is not something that we found and but like sorry, this is not something only we found. There's actually a lot of benchmarks now that show this as well for more complex tasks.
Sure.
So the biggest issue becomes, especially for like if you're exploring an environment like a web application, how do you manage the context in a way that the agent can keep to its original goal and maintain high fidelity over multiple steps? So the simplest way to do this is to basically continuously summarize what you're doing. But the issue is that summaries can sometimes lose fidelity.
Yeah.
So what we did instead is that we split the agent into different to do different things. So as you say, we have a hierarchical system where at the top level we have a planner that essentially explores the environment and then dispatches to a manager. And the manager agent basically determines which of the many task-specific agents it will then dispatch for a particular endpoint. So a manager might think that a specific endpoint has a SQL injection vulnerability, so it'll dispatch that agent. And then that agent will then summarize its findings and then pass it back up to the manager, who can then say, oh, well, it succeeded, and then pass back up to the planner. Or if it didn't, it can say, well, based off of the findings of the SQL injection agent, there actually might be like a cross-site scripting attack, and then apply that task-specific agent. So you can almost think of this as a fancy hack to get around the context issue.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that we found is that when it comes to task-specific agents, having a specific set of documents for the RAG lookup and having a specific prompt for that like very particular task increases performance as well. So those are the two reasons that we had this more complex system.
Yeah, it makes sense. These models are not sort of infinitely capable, or nor do they have sort of infinite memory. And so, to the extent that you can have, a sort of separation of concerns or division of labor, that can kind of help you get around those problems. And why these particular agents? So, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, request forgery, etc. Were these just sort of like the more obvious kinds of exploits, or how did you kind of come up with this particular basket?
Yeah, so we actually have more agents beyond what's here. So basically, we went through the OWASP top 10 and then picked out the ones that we thought we could develop task-specific agents for. And then we have one catch-all agent for the task-specific agents. This diagram is meant for illustrative purposes.
Got it. So you were going, you were not trying necessarily to be selective, more so comprehensive in terms of the different. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it'd be interesting to walk through, some of the results, and maybe even before the results themselves, talk through, how you selected the evaluation criteria, and then maybe kind of what surprised you about the results. And I know we just have been talking about in the context of CVE-Bench that, constructing these benchmarks and figuring out the right way to evaluate these things is actually non-trivial. So maybe talk through some of the logic there, and how you went about making those decisions.
Yeah, this is actually one of the reasons we constructed CVE-Bench is because we basically selected vulnerabilities at random that we could reproduce. And what we actually found is that this selection procedure for vulnerabilities leads to selecting towards easier vulnerabilities than our more comprehensive way of selecting vulnerabilities. In the CVE-Bench paper, we actually didn't filter. We basically picked critical vulnerabilities in a time window. And so there's no like selection of, is this easy to reproduce or not?
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, what we actually showed in the CVE bench paper is that the performance drops when you consider this harder set of vulnerabilities. Nonetheless, we think our work for this paper was really valuable to demonstrate its capabilities and also show gaps in performance when you do and don't have the description of the vulnerability.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just bring up these, figure two. So just give some context when you say with or without the description.
Yeah, so in this paper we focus on the 0-day setting, which is actually the third bar, the HPTSA bar,
Mm-hmm.
which is agent is expected to explore the vulnerability, sorry, the target environment and exploit the vulnerability without knowledge of the vulnerability ahead of time.
Yep.
The right bar, GPT-4 with description, is this one is what we call the 1-day setting,
Mm-hmm.
where the vulnerability is published in the CVE database, but has not been yet patched. And as it turns out, there's a study by Google which shows that the time to patch can be like on average a month. So basically, once someone knows that they need to patch their system, it can take them up to a month to patch it. So
Yeah.
this is
So
an important thing to consider.
I guess that makes it a 30-day vulnerability at that point.
Yeah, yeah. An end day vulnerability.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but one of the nice things about this easier benchmark is that there are clear gaps between the 1-day setting and the 0-day setting, which is the rightmost bar versus the third bar, and then the 0-day setting with our agent framework, and then the GPT-4 agent without a description. So this clearly shows gaps between these two settings, which we thought was scientifically valuable, even though the selection of the vulnerabilities was slightly different than what we did for CVE bench.
Yeah, and was there anything that was kind of surprising to you about these results?
One of the things that we found surprising was how much work or how much exploration our team of agents can do before finding a vulnerability. So we have like a full case study later in the paper, I think, where it actually goes through many, many steps to find the real vulnerability, like 10 plus steps. Yeah, there's this like case study. Yeah. So
Yeah.
here, there's 3 runs and it tries something else. So yeah, so for example, for this XSS agent, it tries 3 different XSS attacks before succeeding. So being able to split out and have a separation of concerns, we found was pretty valuable and probably valuable beyond cybersecurity as well.
And just this might be just like a technical detail, but for something like just the XSS part of it, were all of these different runs contained within its context window so it knew what it had tried before?
Not for these because we actually run at 3 separate times.
These are totally separate runs. Yeah.
Yeah. But the supervisor agent gets a
Is
summary from the runs.
Yes. Okay. That all makes sense. And then one thing that I wanted to make sure we mentioned very briefly because it relates to something you said earlier. I forget if it was in this paper or the CVE paper, but you mentioned that between pass at 5 and pass at 1, you felt like pass at 5 is sort of the more relevant criteria. And I won't steal your thunder, but maybe just say like why that is the more important criteria.
Yeah, so maybe I'll first describe what these metrics are. So
Yeah.
pass at one is basically what people consider the standard accuracy. So if you run it n times, how many times does it succeed? Pass at 5 says that if for every vulnerability, you run the agent 5 times, and if it succeeds any of the 5 times, we consider it a success. So for lots of applications, people really care about pass at one because you want the agent to succeed the first time you try it.
Yeah.
For cybersecurity, we care more about pass at 5 because if the agent succeeds anytime, the system is compromised.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back to the point we talked about earlier. So this is why we think pass at 5 is a more reasonable metric. You know, a determined attacker might even try 20 runs. So you can imagine that this could even go up from there.
Yeah. And then a very interesting thing I noticed is that you actually used LangChain and LangGraph for some of the work here, and I'm always just curious to get feedback from folks who have used some of these agent frameworks for real world serious work, and so I'm just curious like what did you find helpful about LangChain and LangGraph? What strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons, etc.
Yeah, this is a bit tricky. There's a lot of good things, and there's also a lot of things that we wish were better. The good thing is that there's just a lot of default like stuff in place that you can just like iterate quickly on if you want to just like try some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think the con is that especially for advanced work, customization is really, really difficult, especially with LangGraph. That being said, I don't know if there's like a strictly better framework. We're actually probably going to move off to write a lot of this stuff ourselves to do some further work to understand, for example, if reasoning models do better than non-reasoning models on cybersecurity tasks.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's quite difficult to do a lot of customization, but it also has a lot of built-in functionality. So it just depends on your use case.
Yeah. And any thoughts on just agent frameworks in general or similar commentary?
Yeah, this is also quite challenging to say in general because the space moves so fast. If you know exactly what you need to do and you're confident that that exact task is not going to change at any like much in the future, I think using an agentic framework is great. I think if you are in the R&D phase, that overhead is actually not necessarily what you want. And being able to have the flexibility and actually just like using the APIs like and jerry-rigging your own framework might actually help you move faster. That being said, if you want to have like a mature thing and it's all set and fixed, maybe that's not the best approach.
Mm-hmm. What if you were thinking more forward looking, you constructed this very interesting, almost like meta agent, and you called it in the paper HPTSA, which what does that stand for?
Hierarchical planning and task-specific agents.
Okay, makes sense. If you were again forward looking, what would you be most what would be the most exciting or potentially productive directions if you were trying to sort of further increase its capabilities? Like, what would you next try to kind of add on to this?
Yeah, so one really simple thing we want to try is to try out reasoning models. Reasoning models are unfortunately outrageously expensive because they generate tons and tons of output tokens. So
Yeah.
we want to be a little bit careful with how we run the experiments. That's a big step up. We're also interested in having the agent itself craft a task-specific agent. So one of the things we find is that the prompt matters quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the agent can say, well, I'm gonna like create a new agent with like a prompt for something that doesn't fall under the task that you told me about. That might be an interesting way of basically exploring more efficiently. And then we're also excited to do things like use like a web browser with the GUI the graphical interface, as opposed to just the HTML from the page itself, and then other advanced forms of elicitation.
And the agents, the kind of sub agents in this work, there's sort of prompting or prompt engineering, you could call it. They get access to these tools. Was there any sort of like fine tuning on the particular subtask that they're focused on, or were they just kind of out of the box with prompts and tools?
There was no fine tuning on our end. We used the base models. We used GPT 4.0 for all of the experiments in the CVE-Bench paper, I believe, and it does a pretty good job of tool use for our specific use case.
Yeah. Lastly, I wanted to ask you about, there's this cost analysis that you run, within the paper. And, I don't know how important the exact numbers ended up being, but they struck me as being, fairly low, in terms of the cost of basically running the full machinery here, which I guess is just the inference cost of the tokens. Just like kind of like reflect on that, what are the implications of that? Like, how should we think about this again? If you think about just attackers who need to only, get through your defenses once in order to win, like, should we be worried about the fact that I think it was like $24 or something that it costs to basically run the full thing? Is that how should people think about that?
Yeah, so if you look at cost trends for base models over
Mm-hmm.
time, the trend is all down. There was a plot I saw from, I forgot the exact report, but the cost of GPT-4 level intelligence has gone from like $60 per million tokens to like 2.5. So that's a pretty big drop. And if you just extrapolate that forward, that $24 is going to go down to, if you drop that by 10x, it's going to go down to 250, let's say. And if you drop that by another 10x, that's going to be 25 cents. 25 cents, you can just run this like all over the place. Yeah, so I think at $25, it's probably cost prohibitive, but at 25 cents, it's you just deploy it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the trends are all pointing towards we're going to get more capable intelligence for cheaper. So I think that the number in the paper should be viewed as a point in time estimate, and this is just going to go down over time. And this is why I basically say that and think that organizations should be proactive about putting better cybersecurity defenses in place because today it's probably too expensive, but maybe 24 months from now it'll be extremely cheap. And that's going to cause a big difference in terms of the amount of automatic attacks from threat actors who want to hijack your systems.
Something I'm just thinking about as you say that, I feel like there have been past either cybersecurity attacks or just sort of online scams, what have you, where at a certain point, if you can make it, maybe it was profitable at a certain point, but due to various defenses we can put in place, we can sort of make it unprofitable again. And I'm just sort of wondering, going back to, obscurity defense and, all these different tactics you can deploy, maybe it ends up being something where you almost just try to exhaust the tokens. You just try to make them have to use so many tokens in order to get through that it just sort of doesn't make sense in the end. I don't know what that would mean practically, but does that at all resonate?
Yeah, yeah. So there are different kinds of threat actors for cybersecurity. There's like nation states, and then, maybe that's not the best defense for that. But I think in a lot of circumstances, what you really care about is a cost benefit trade-off of making it just too expensive. For example, if you have encryption and two-factor authentication on, all of a sudden it becomes really difficult to do certain kinds of attacks, and so people focus on other kinds of attacks. And the goal is always to just to raise the cost. Exhausting token limits, I think, is a really simple way. You can do this on client side, have a JavaScript application that just like explodes out your
Right.
JavaScript, your HTML or whatever. A really interesting idea. And there are many other ways I think you can go about raising the cost of attacks. And you thought of it one creative way. I'm sure there's many others as well. And this is what I encourage people to think about. Just put best practices in place so that these attacks are too expensive for people to want to use automated methods to attack.
Daniel called me creative, so that just makes my week. You just that was it right there. Thank you, Daniel. No, but really, seriously, thank you for doing this, Daniel. I really appreciate it. This was fun, and as I mentioned at the start, you're a very impressive researcher and someone I respect a lot. So, thank you for your contributions, and very excited to see what you publish next.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a great time.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us.